2.2, find slope and rate of change. This time we're going to talk about calculating slope. We'll talk about the formula. The big problem people usually have is to remember if it's plus or minus, whether the x's are on top or y's are on top, and then a common question is, does it matter which point I start with? So remember, if it's graphed in the coordinate plane, you can always count, and I'm not going to take the time to do the counting on here, but remember, if it is a graph, especially if you're in a test or whatever, and you're just asked what's the slope, or to write the slope in y-intercept, write the equation in slope-intercept form, you know, count, it'll work. But we're going to be dealing with the formula here. So the formula for slope, y sub 2 minus y sub 1 over x sub 2 minus x sub 1. And there's nothing magical about what has to come first. You can start with either one, but remember, like we talked about last time, it's the change in y's. It's the difference in y's and the change in x's, the difference in x's. And so if you think difference, remember that it's minuses. So when you're thinking about slope, think about slope as directions from one place to another. Well, you can't, you know, have directions. It's just going to, you know, you have to start somewhere. So we're going to just take one of our points, right? They have to come together. That's our starting point. And then the other point has to come together. That's going to be our other point. So it doesn't matter which one we start with. We just have to make sure we don't mix and match. So when I'm writing a problem, if I see a problem in a book, I'm doing a problem in a book, when I'm writing it, I find it easiest to write the problem with the 2 points one above each other. They may give them in the book side by side, but if I do it like this, it helps me gather the things together better. Otherwise, I tend to get mixed up. So then, remember we said that this is just going to be one of our points. It doesn't matter which one it is. There's nothing magic about the sub 1 and sub 2. It's just helping you keep them straight, right? So those guys have to together, the red guys have to go together, and the green guys have to go together. And so our y's are going to go on top. So we're going to go 5 minus 2. I could just as easily have said 2 minus 5. But if I start with the 5, then I have to start with the negative 2. And actually, I didn't do something that I normally do. I'll mention it next time. So 5 minus 2, pretty straightforward. Negative 2 minus 4, some people find it helpful to change that to a plus negative one way or another. We get negative 6. So when you see a positive divided by a negative, remember we want the whole number to be negative. We don't want to think about it being either the top or bottom negative. When we write it, we want to write it as a negative number. Now, when I graph it, if I need to graph it, then think about the fact that, let's see, I got negative 2, 5, and then 4, 2. So remember we talked in the last video about having a visual. So, you know, if you got a slope of negative 1/2, even if you weren't asked to graph it, you might just want to kind of see, hey, yeah, that does go down less, you know, it goes over more than it goes down. Looks like that's less than 1. Because a slope of, if I just pick one of the points, a slope of negative 1 would go through all those diagonal lines. So that one's not, it's less, you know, it's a flatter line than negative 1. So negative 1/2 works. It makes sense. And we're always going to simplify them like I did with the 3 and the 6. Let's do another one. Now, I said before last time there's something else I do. Besides writing the points vertical like this, I have another trick that I want to share. So we're going to have 8, 2, and 5, negative 7. Again, if you have a graph, you could graph it to double check if you're right. You're going to have to be able to do it without graph paper, so you can't rely on that. When I calculate, I actually put the minus in there first because it helps me, especially when I have negatives in the problem, and it helps me make sure that I don't forget the negatives. So we said the y's have to go on top, so just pick either point to go on top. Or to start with, so negative 7 minus 2, and then the x's on the bottom. If I started with the negative 7, I have to start with the 5, so 5 minus 8. So I have negative minus a 2, or maybe I want to think of that as plus negative 2, so I have negative 7 and negative 2, I have negative 9, and then 5 minus 8, or 5 plus negative 8, either way I go, I get negative 3. Now I've got a negative divided by a negative, so that's going to be a positive. Now, I can write it like this, and if I'm graphing it, that's kind of a good way to think of it because it's up 3 over 1. But if you answer that, you're never going to see that on a multiple choice test. That's not really going to be written in equations, so you just want to write it as the whole number. Now, if you look at that line that I graphed, notice it's rising a lot more steeply than 1. I want you to always think about what would a slope of 1 look like. If I was at this point and I was going 1, it would go through all those little x's of where the two boxes are. So that's a slope of 1. It makes sense that that line is much steeper than 1. 3 is bigger than 1. I promised you the special case is the math version. So if I have these 2 points, 4, 2, and 4, 5. Now, if you can just think about it, what didn't change? Did the x's not change or did the y's not change? Well, the x's didn't change, so it's going to be 4, 2, and 4, 5, right? All of the points on this line are going to have a 4 for the x. So did we really have to use the equation? Nah, we can just think about it. And you can't divide by 0, so that's why this one is undefined. Remember the trick, vertical, undefined. If I have this kind, and I have negative 1, 3, and then 2, 3, this time my y's didn't change. So my y's didn't change. 3 minus 3 is 0. My x has changed. I don't care what number's down here. I'm not even going to do the math because I just know that it's going to be negative 1, 3 and 2, 3. So every point on this line is going to have a y equals 3, right? That's got a slope of 0. 0 divided by any number is 0. So our recap, you've got to know the formula and how to use it. Remember, it's the change or the difference in y's, so that's why the negative, it's a minus, not a plus. Remember, it's y's a rise. Remember, it's change in y first. Remember, the steeper it is, the faster it rises. And it doesn't matter which point you start with. You just have to be consistent. Don't mix and match.